we make unconscious judgments of someone's trustworthiness in 33 milliseconds.
Okay.
33 milliseconds. Do you think there's any time for communications to take place? No. It's all nonverbal. So when we're engaged, we lean forward. So if I'm talking about something I really like, you tend to lean forward. And when you don't like something, you lean back.
Did you know that most of your communication is nonverbal? That means what you don't say matters as much as what you do. Today we're going to dive into the fascinating world of body language with Dr. Abbie, who's a renowned expert in the field, and we're going to discuss body language of leadership and at your workplace. You're watching The Sharma Show. I'm your host, Prerna S Sharma, and if you like the episode, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's dive in. Welcome, Dr. Abbie. How are you?
Good, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. I'm so glad you could be here. And let's start with the basics. Why does body language really matter in the area of your workplace or leadership?
Well, body language matters in every area that is people interacting, right? So if we think about how we've evolved, before we even had the ability to communicate verbally, we were a social species. So something was obviously going on. And we can see through fossil evidence that we were a social species before we actually had the ability to produce language. So there's certain bones in the throat that are needed to be able to produce words. And we didn't have those, but we could see that we were social. So how do we communicate? Well, non-verbally. And we can see through neuroscience that when people engage in certain kinds of behaviors, it triggers certain brain regions associated with threat detection or oxytocin and bonding. So we can see that there's a biological component to nonverbals. So there's no denying that evolutionarily and biologically, it's a really important aspect of communication. So we now translate that into leadership. What are some of the most important factors of being a good leader? Well, appearing trustworthy, appearing confident, because competence and confidence are often very much equated. So these things like trustworthiness, competence, and confidence, they come largely from nonverbal communication. For example, we make unconscious judgments, and we know this from the literature. We make unconscious judgments of someone's trustworthiness in 33 milliseconds.
Okay.
33 milliseconds. Do you think there's any time for communications to take place? No. It's all nonverbal. Now, that doesn't mean that that judgment is absolutely going to hold, but our perception often creates our reality. So if you look at someone and build a perception of them like we have evolved to do, we go in with this preconception of how they are, and we tend to kind of interpret their behavior in a certain way. So the importance of them being trustworthy is obviously very important, but I say there's two sides to leadership. One is being, and one is being perceived. So if you're perceived as trustworthy, but you're not, then you might initially gain trust, but lose it. If you're not perceived as trustworthy, but are, you might not gain it even though you're worth it. So you've got to have those two components. And with leadership, that perceiving is when nonverbals really comes in and why it's so important as a foundation.
Especially because if somebody has already developed an opinion about you or is prejudiced already, they might go to thinking that way, which is so crucial, right? Especially at your workplace. So what are some key things that somebody can do at work to really have that perception going for them, meaning to exude confidence, to build rapport, to have that sweet spot between confidence and also warmth, because you also want to be approachable enough, but not maybe too approachable?
That is such a great question, because to talk about what people need to do, I often address what not to do first, because there are a lot of myths in body language, and understandably so, because it is appealing. Like, it's great to say, okay, if I present myself this way and just change these little things, I can have this big impact. And although the research is extraordinarily impactful, people have kind of taken a lot of the research and run with it and made these extraordinary claims. And it has made the field of body language look a little bit like junk science because of these over-the-top claims. So it's really important to know what not to listen to first. Like if I say, okay, well, how do you appear confident and powerful as a leader, say an attorney? People go, oh, well, I'm going to look at Harvey Specter from Suits. And they base it off these really over-the-top notions. And if I look at, okay, well, what's a powerful body language? We go, the power pose, that big pose that has been completely torn apart in the literature for having not much scientific merit. But we look at these ideals and try and implement them, then they don't work effectively. So one thing that I always teach when it comes to how do we appear confident is you need to understand the difference between confidence and dominance. Because when we teach people how to be a good leader, often what they're being taught is how to appear dominant. And actually what happens psychologically is we see dominance as a threat factor and we see confidence as a trustworthy factor. So confidence is related to competence, but dominance isn't. But the two often get really inflated and they do overlap, which is where a lot of the confusion comes in. So let's kind of split those apart of what not to do and what to do as a leader. Confidence is all about how I feel in myself. So it's all about me. Dominance is about other people. It's about how I feel about me in comparison to others. So not I'm good enough, it's I'm better than. And you see this in the body language because confidence is I'm comfortable in my space. So you see people, their limbs typically are away from the torso. So my arms, I'm not really closed in. I'm more open palm gestures. And I'm really fluid at my movement. Like there's no anxiety, because when we have high anxiety and stress levels of cortisol, it can create really rigid muscles and it creates tension in the muscles. So when people are really tight, it's often because there's a lot of cortisol and anxiety. So confident people, they don't have that cortisol flowing through enough and they're, very fluid. And I say you want to appear confident, imagine you're moving through water. Dominance, on the other hand, is big and bold. And this is where the confusion is, because confidence is open and it's not closed off, but there's a line. Dominance is about taking up as much space as possible, because it's not only am I comfortable in my space, this is my space. And now it translates into other people as well of I can get into your space. So you see people you see the man spreading, where they open their legs really wide, and they may put their hand on your shoulder or take up loads of space that other people should have ownership to as well. I might sit as wide as possible, and you see, the people in the gym walking around as big as possible, really exaggerated. That kind of exaggerated openness is very dominant. And then we have things like staring behavior. So confident people are very good with eye contact. And when you're speaking, I'm going to give you eye contact. But people get really uncomfortable with sustained eye contact. So confidence is, I'm really comfortable to look around the room. You're talking, I'm going to give you eye contact, but I give you a little bit of a break and I can come back to you. And it's it's fluid, it's comfortable, it's smooth. Dominance is that fixed gaze behavior. It's very intimidating when someone is staring at you. So there's those things, and then gestures again being very sharp. If I'm dominant, I'm constantly very sharp and quick and bold. But confidence is, again, I'm smooth. I don't need to be as sharp. It's more inviting. So I would say starting as a starting point, understanding the difference between those two things is a really great place to start.
Okay. So I think there's a fine line,
yes,
right, between the dominance and the confidence part, because sometimes people might perceive or think they're confident, but they're sort of crossing over to the other side, taking up other people's space, or the staring thing that you said. One thing about the eye contact, so eye contact is good overall, right?
Yes.
If let's say you're talking to your boss or manager and they don't make, and it's a one-to-one conversation and they don't make eye contact with you and they're giving you a little bit of eye contact and most of the time looking over your head or looking at other places, is that more of a dominance thing or more dismissive that I don't really I'm not that invested in this conversation.
It can be a multitude of things. With other people's body language, it's really important not to assign an absolute to it. So eye contact can be very intimidating for people who are nervous. Some people are very uncomfortable with eye contact because it makes them feel seen. So it can be a dismissive thing of, if I'm talking, I expect you to have eye contact with me, and then if you're talking, I'm looking away. But it can also be sometimes when you're really engaged and you're really fixed on listening to what someone says, some people have a tendency to look down or look away because they kind of need to get rid of the other stimuli to process. And then other people have a difficulty with eye contact. So as a coach, I teach people to try and maintain it as a respect and confidence thing, but also be aware that if someone isn't giving you eye contact, don't necessarily say to yourself, this is dismissive. You have to take it as a whole with everything else. So what is the rest of their body doing? So one thing that you should be cautious of is orientation. Now, this is in yourself and in others. So when we're engaged, we lean forward. So if I'm talking about something I really like, you tend to lean forward.
Yeah.
And when you don't like something, you lean back. And again, this is an evolved response because say there's a danger, what are we going to do if we want to get away from it unconsciously? We're going to try and create
lean
space.
Back. Yeah.
Or something that we find disgusting is an evolved response, we take space. If something is pleasurable or something is positive, you want to move towards it. And we also have that with orientation. So if you're here and I'm talking to you and I'm leaning away, psychologically, I'm trying to create some distance. If I'm leaning towards you, I'm engaged. I'm showing you that I'm paying attention. I want to be close. So in yourself, make sure that when you are talking to someone, it's a negotiation or in that interview, you're orientating towards them, not away. But if looking at their body, are they orientating towards you or looking away? Same with leaning. So if the rest of their body is showing like they're nodding, they're listening along, they're showing you active listening, they're orientating towards you, but they're looking in a different direction, don't take that one cue as absolutely dismissive because the rest of the body is saying something different. So you don't want to say, hey, I notice you're not giving me eye contact, because that can be really uncomfortable for people. Try and just take the rest of the body as a whole and don't fixate on the one cue. But in yourself, when you're trying to improve your nonverbals, try and be as overall as possible of, okay, all of these cues are important, so let me try and ensure I maintain good eye contact, ensure that I am engaging in the appropriate orientation. Because, for example, one thing that's really important as a leader is to be seen as empathetic. And there have been studies showing that when doctors are providing diagnosis results to a patient, if they're orientating with their upper body, but the rest of the body is orientating away, they're perceived as less empathetic, even by a third-party observer and by the patient. And it's because they're not fully non-verbally engaged. And we don't always say to ourselves, their lower body isn't orientating, so they're less empathetic. It's an unconscious judgment that we make. Most of this happens below the level of consciousness, but it does have an effect. So those factors like eye contact, orientation, confidence, they all join together to create this overall impact. And then things like mimicry for building rapport, verbal mimicry as well as nonverbal, adding those things in are really important as well for cooperation.
Okay. So let's say I have so many questions, two mainly about, let's say it's a one-on-one meeting or you're discussing something important. One is how much nodding is good and how much is just, when are you just over nodding? Because I think sometimes I did not know this when I started doing my podcasts and looking at myself.
Yeah.
I realized, do I nod too much?
Yes.
So nodding is one. And the other one is hand gestures. Can we use our hands in a way that, as you said, with mimicry, can help us get what we want? That could be with a manager, an employee, or during negotiation.
Yeah. So let's start with the nodding. And I was laughing because I had the same thing. I would watch my podcasts back and I would be nodding the whole time. And I'm not always consciously thinking, okay, not to show active listening. You're doing it because you're in agreement, you want them to follow along, and you're showing engagement. And you just kind of naturally, continuously nod sometimes.
Right.
And it is funny to watch as an observer, like, wow, that's really annoying how much they're nodding. And sometimes you do it because you're like, I want to show engagement, but sometimes it just happens. So I would say there is, both with hand gestures and nodding, there is no absolute amount you should be showing. And I think saying to someone, this is how many times you need to show it per minute, it creates this cognitive load of you're thinking about so much at once. And then what happens is when you're saying, okay, I need to do this, need to do this, need to do this, so much of your cognitive energy is focused on your nonverbals that the verbals lack. So you're not actually able to have that successful negotiation because you're not fully present. So what I try and say is, you want your own natural behavioral repertoire, what is comfortable and normal for you. And we're not trying to script this perfect nonverbal presence. We're trying to adapt yours to make yours most effective for you. Because I'm not someone who is big and bold, whereas I have colleagues who are big and bold. So what is effective for them won't be comfortable for me. So it won't be effective for me because it'll feel artificial. So it's about improving and adapting your own behavioral repertoire rather than fitting an absolute fixed number of exactly what to show. When it comes to the nodding, though, I would say just self-monitor. So if you are nodding a lot and say you've been nodding, for the last things that they've been saying, maybe try and show interest in a different way. Because often we nod to show them I'm listening along. So maybe pause that and go, yeah, show with your verbals that you're listening, or lean forward, eye contact. So don't just use that one signal of active listening. Try and hold back a little bit and show in another way. Maybe like if you're smiling, if they've made a point of it and you're smiling, you don't also need to smile and nod. If you are aware, I have been nodding a lot. So try and kind of withhold that. It is a difficult thing to do, to naturally self-monitor at the beginning. But once you have been practicing it a lot, it becomes much easier. And there's a lot of online tools now that we can use. I mean, one of the best ways to monitor is obviously watching yourself.
Right.
So if you have done podcasts, then it's uncomfortable to watch yourself back, but watch yourself and make notes of, okay, I tend to do this too much, or this looks a little robotic. And if you don't want to do it on camera because it is out there, then practice. Practice at home. There is a tool called Virtual Sapiens. I'm an advisor on their board, and it is like a virtual interviewing software. So it has many different functions, but one thing that they do is they will have Rachel, who's the CEO. She is on screen asking questions and running it like an interview. So you answer and respond like a normal interview, and it monitors your nonverbals at the same time. And then after that kind of fake interview, it will give you a roundup summary of what you did right and what you could improve on. And there's loads of things like that. And even just observing yourself, there is and it's very reasonably priced as well, and very accessible. So these things are things that you can be doing prior to engaging in an interview to monitor your own nonverbals and practice. I would say practice in a low stakes situation rather than, you don't want to be practicing in like a TED talk and then reviewing the TED talk. You want to be doing it way before that important meeting,
Yeah, for sure. And I wish I did it earlier. I mean, I'm just starting my podcast now. Let's say I didn't do this. I wish I had monitored this before because I would have known these little things that I do and I'm used to doing, and I thought they were normal. But it would have helped me just tone it down a little bit, because it does change people's perception, right? If you're nodding and smiling a lot, even if you're confident, even if you're verbally great, it helps noticing these couple things. Very interested in that website that you just mentioned. I'll definitely check that out and recommend it to my friends too, because I have a couple friends going in for huge interviews soon.
Yeah.
So it'll really help them. What about hand gestures? And how to get people to really, how to do it the right way. And is there like mimicry in that too?
Yeah. So interestingly, with the hands, there was a study done looking at where people look the most for public speakers, and it was the hands and the face. So the hands equally as the face, which is really interesting. But of course, it's because they're big and they're bold. So if I'm moving my hands, doesn't matter what I'm doing with my face, it catches your attention because it's in your peripheral vision. So one thing that has been shown is open palm gestures are really important when it comes to hand gestures, because from an evolutionary perspective, if you can't see my hands, you don't know if I have a weapon. And same with the back of the hands, the brain is saying, is there a threat in their hands? So just naturally, we are more receptive to open palms because it's like hey, I've got nothing here to hurt you. But again, going back to that natural behavioral repertoire, some people, like the CEO at Social Engineer, he's Italian. So he is all hands all the time. Everything he's talking, his hands are here, so natural for him. And because it fits with the way that he is, because he is big and bold, it doesn't feel inauthentic. And he has found a way, like he's not bold with his gestures per se. He is fluid. He's very confident. He's just very animated.
Mm-hmm.
But it works for him in his caricature. Doesn't with me, because that isn't how I present. If I tried to be as animated as him, it would look very inauthentic. So again, it's not about changing how much you do, but doing them correctly. If you are someone that you don't move your arms much and you don't move your hands much and you keep your hands together, that is a very bad sign. And if you do show a lot of hand movements, but you do a lot of self-touch, that is a very bad sign, because when we show anxiousness, that is really the opposite of confidence. Someone who is confident is not anxious. Someone who is anxious is not confident. And when we are anxious, our nervous system is overactive. And then what happens is we engage in self-touch, because this self-touch behavior, like me rubbing my hands together or rubbing my hand on my arm, it activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which calms down the nervous system. So it is a behavior that helps us self-regulate, which is great if you're nervous to self-regulate. But what you're doing is signaling to everyone else through your gestures that you are nervous. So if you catch yourself with your hands together a lot, and maybe you're rubbing your hands or, pulling, a lot of people pull at their fingers when they're nervous, or kind of play with the ends of their fingers. And that's because there's a lot of nerve endings there. So it signals to the brain much quicker, okay, everything's okay. But you're also showing everyone else, hey, I'm nervous. Look what I'm doing with my hands. So when it comes to the hands, keeping them as separate as possible, doing an occasional kind of putting your hands together if you're making a point, fine. But generally, having everything closed and tight is a sign of nervousness. You want to avoid doing so. Palms facing out, limbs outside of the body, and again, fluid, not sharp. And there are certain gestures we don't like we don't like pointing, and a closed fist as well. We don't really like these things because that closed fist, again, it registers in the brain as a threat.
Yeah.
So just fluid and comfortable. And if you're in your head thinking, I have to show this gesture and have to show this gesture, to me, that's a warning sign, because it's saying that you're really trying to be something that you're not, and it's going to appear very inauthentic. Like if you say, okay, I have to do this, and it's so uncomfortable and abnormal for you, it's not going to come off very natural. So just tweaks, and then having those tweaks practiced until they feel natural, and then tweaking a little bit more, practiced until they feel natural, tweaking a little bit more. Over time, you can't add all of these things at once and try and do everything at once and then think that you can go into an interview and be perfect non-verbally. You've got to make small adjustments. I say with gestures, it seems like it's a simple thing, but actually it can be a really complicated thing because you're in your head so much about it. And the same as with mimicry, which we can come back to because that is really specific too. I say it's kind of like a game of tennis where you can know all of the rules. You can know what works non-verbally, but just because you know it doesn't mean you can go and perfect it first time. You're not going to be a master tennis player straight away. It takes practice, just like any skill. Nonverbal intelligence is a skill, just like any other.
So when I was sitting, like just now, you saw my hands were closed like that. What does that say?
So when we're like this, occasionally, especially if we're sat, I wouldn't say that that's a problem. Like I occasionally sit like this, and this when we have the staple is it's a power pose, but it's the squeezing. It's the squeezing and it's the self-touch. Like this can be a comfortable thing, and that's fine. Like there's no anxiousness here. There's no kind of fidgety behavior. This is necessarily self-touch. It's when this changes into me kind of
around.
moving
Okay.
around and I'm squeezing and there's some tension here. Now I look nervous. So just look at the difference. Like we're talking, I'm using my hands to gesture, things like that. You know, if I'm making a point, I might move my hand, unclip them, and then put them back and carry on talking. That's very different than if my hands are together and I'm like engaging in
constantly
self-touch.
moving.
And
okay.
Very, very different perception.
I've seen a lot of men play with their rings all the time.
Yeah, repetitive gestures, anything that we repeat can self-soothe us. So a lot of people do this as a sign of nervousness. They're playing with the ring because it's repetitive. Like a lot of people will play with a pen, bite a pen, tap a pen, shake their foot. And that repetitive gesture, it helps soothe our nervous system. But what it does is signal to other people, hey, I'm a little bit anxious. Like when you see people play with an earring or play with a necklace. And a lot of people do it with playing with their hair too. They twiddle their hair. And again, we have a lot of nerve endings on hair follicles. So if we're trying to calm down our nervous system, playing with our hair can help it signal, hey, you know, chill out, chill out. So again, there's a biological reason why we do these behaviors. But psychologically, what we're signaling is I am nervous and I'm looking to calm myself down. So if you do find yourself engaging in something repetitively and you notice, think, oh, try and stop. And if I say, like, if you're really struggling and you are really nervous, try and mask it. So say I want to play with my wedding ring, but I'm noticing all my hands are present, but you can't see my lower body. Okay, if I really cannot get rid of that nervousness, try and tap my foot instead. Because in an ideal world, I would correct all the nonverbals.
Yeah,
but it's not always
course.
an ideal world. Sometimes you have a level of anxiety that you can't seem to shake.
Right.
And if in those situations, compensating with a less obvious behavior is perfectly fine. And then working on that nervousness separately. But if you can't make it fully go away, try and translate it into something less obvious.
That's very helpful because, of course, you know, if you're in an interview and if you're a bit anxious or in somebody else's space who's very dominant, you're going to feel anxious. And you can't really correct that. But if you want to self-soothe, you can maybe tap your feet or something like that. I've noticed I will shake my legs a lot sometimes, especially when I want to be done with the meeting. Like initially I'm fine and then it runs too long. So is that also mean anxiousness or maybe irritability, or it's just, I don't know, just want to get over with this?
Because if you think about it, let's think about the fight or flight response. So the flight response means I want to get out of here, right? So if I'm in a situation I don't want to be in, the fight is I'm going to fight my way out. And if we look at the blood flow goes to the chest and the arms. Makes sense. If I'm going to fight, this is where I need a lot of my blood flowing so I can be strong and powerful. That's why you see people who are aggressive, you know, they pump out their chest. That's why you see it, you know, they're getting big and bold, and that can be a sign of threat. And then you see the nostrils flare out as they're trying to get more oxygen. But people in flight, when they want to leave a situation, if you actually look at the blood flow in the body, it goes to the legs. So the feet are really telling, because if I say, okay, run out of this room, but do it without moving your feet first, it's really difficult. And if you try and do that, you kind of get a little bit unsteady. The first thing you do is move your feet in the direction you want to go. Natural, makes sense. And again, from the blood flow perspective, that's where we need to get out. We need our feet to move. So if you want to get out of a situation, like you said with your meeting, your feet are saying, let's go. So if you are in an interaction with someone and you see their feet start to turn away, their body is saying, I'm trying to be polite, but I want to go. And I see this sometimes when you see men and women talking, and there's, a man trying to engage in conversation, say at a bar. I've seen it in universities. They've stopped them, hey, talking after getting a coffee. And you see the woman's feet moving away. And the man is still fully orientated towards her. And she's still being very polite, but her body is saying, I really want to leave. So if your feet are doing that tap, 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 shaking, moving away, it's your body saying, do you want to get out of this situation? So as a leader, if you start to have a negotiation or in an interaction, you see that lower body movement, let them go. Let them go. They want to go. Maybe they're hungry.
They've
maybe they need
out.
to loo. Just stop holding them in a conversation prison and let them go.
I've actually used the leaning in and the leaning back in negotiations sometimes, where when I want the other person to think that I'm actually going to get up and leave, or I'm, the price isn't like, it doesn't make sense for me. Initially, I'm like leaning in, and then I'm like, no, that's all I can do.
It's disengagement.
Yes. So maybe then it puts a little bit of pressure on them to come back with a better price or something like that.
Yeah. No, it is. They feel like they're losing you. When you lean away, especially if you show kind of like disengagement with other nonverbals, instantly I've lost her attention. I need to do something to regain her attention now.
Yeah. One time I zipped up my bag. I was like,
a great way is if you have belongings to move the belongings, because it shows like, okay, I'm starting to get my thing together. Very British way is you slap your knee and go, right. In England, if someone is sat and they slap their knee and go, right, it means done, conversation's over, they're getting up. Yeah, that is, I don't know why it is that way, but right, it means, okay, everybody now knows that is a universal British signal of conversation is done. So
you slap your knee, and it could be either knee, right?
Either, but it's usually, I slap with my right hand on my knee, like right then. And it just is a thing that everybody knows. Conversation's done. And if someone does that and then you keep them in that conversation prison, they have signaled to you, I want to go. And what we also need to remember with nonverbals is it is a form of communication. And when we are showing someone nonverbally, we feel a certain way. If I'm showing them disengagement and they're not responding appropriately, even though I haven't said, hey, I want to leave, what we're doing is we're not feeling validated. So if you are a leader and you're not actually able to assess people's nonverbals effectively, you're not going to respond as effectively. And people are left feeling less validated because I'm showing you I don't want to be here. I'm showing you this is how I feel, and you're not responding appropriately. And a lot of the time you hear an argument with couples of, yeah, but I was showing you. Yeah, but you didn't tell me. Yeah, but you should have known I was showing you. And a lot of that is nonverbal intelligence of I am signaling you my feelings. I'm expecting you to respond appropriately. It's that unwritten rule that if I show you how I'm feeling, you should respond to that feeling. And that does require, again, nonverbal intelligence, so important as a leader.
Interesting that you said that thing about what people do in Britain. And that also makes me think there's different cultural roots.
Absolutely.
With body language. For example, Indians nod a lot. Like there's a lot of memes on social media and it's hilarious. It's not just nodding like that. It's for us. You'll see any Indian person who's actually from India. There's so much nonverbal communication. That's like, yeah. And then there's this, which means, okay. And then there's this, like, let's go. Like, there's so much nodding. We move our heads all the time. And people don't really understand, what is he? Is this a yes? Is this a no? What is going on?
Yeah, and it's a really important factor to consider. So, for example, I came from the UK, and now I live in America. And the cultures are pretty similar, but there are some differences. And because we speak the same language, sometimes I forget that there is that cultural divide. And things like personal space is one of them that really differs across cultures. Like in Europe, not the UK, they're very comfortable in each other's space, very huggy. The proximity bubble is much smaller, so people are very, very comfortable.
Yes.
Like my Dutch friends, they get very close to me, and I'm very uncomfortable because in the UK we like a lot of personal space. Um, People who are Dutch, their personal bubble is much smaller, and in New York, it's more similar to the UK where they like more space.
Yeah.
But in other places in the US, it's much smaller. So when I came here and people are talking to me, they're getting very close. I'm like,
Yeah.
move, get back.
Yes. Yeah.
And I'm being abrasive to them because it's their culture.
You're moving back.
I
Yeah.
have come into their place and now I'm not responding to their nonverbals effectively. So if you have, say, someone from another culture coming into your space, one way as a leader to be really effective is, you're never going to learn every gesture from every culture. It's too difficult. But understanding, okay, well, what are they greeting nonverbals? What are traditional greetings for that culture? What are traditional, how do I say goodbye? Things like that, just to show respect of I've taken the time to learn about your culture. So if you do have someone, say, from Southeast Asia or India or Thailand or anywhere that is not your country, learn their greeting gestures and learn, okay, what are typical gestures? And just be aware they might do something that feels a little bit uncomfortable. Like I remember I had a conference and afterwards, one of the other attendees was like, oh, great speech, and then kissed me on the cheek. And I'm like, we don't do that in
That's a
the UK.
lot. Yes. Yeah.
Like one cheek, other cheek. And I'm like, did this man
No.
just kiss my face? And
Yeah.
I was very abrasive and let back, and it led to a really negative interaction because I wasn't respectful of his cultural nonverbals, and he wasn't respectful of mine because when he came up close, he should have read my body language of me moving back. But I should have also taken the time to understand and respond effectively to, okay, this is a cultural display. So there's been a lot of famous mishaps. For example, I think it was Clinton who went to Australia. And in America, if I put my two fingers up and turn them around, it means peace. And in the UK and Australia, that means it's flipping the bird, it's swearing at them. But it's not in America. To me, that's why I don't do it, even when I non-verbally, because to me, I'm still swearing.
Yeah.
And he was trying to say, hey, peace. And it was a peace rally. But what he was actually doing is swearing at everybody. And it led to a big public kind of embarrassment of didn't learn that nonverbal behavior. And it led to this situation. So small things like that can happen. So culture does play a big part. And as a leader, you do want to brush up on some different cultural behaviors, especially say you have someone new to your team. Trying to understand if they have some cultural differences with the way they interact will help you lead them better because they might not be aware that they're being offensive or they're not being as effective because to them it's natural. And also to help other people be more respectful of them as well.
You talked about kissing the cheeks and the space thing. I've had an issue with shaking hands post-COVID. So I always do a fist bump. But I also feel like that's, it's like I loved shaking hands before that. And I think it's great to do that because it really tells the other person how strong is their grip and stuff like that. I always got a sense of, and I felt more confident when I used to shake hands. But now, and especially I work at the hospital. So I'm not going to go around shaking everybody's hand and have to use sanitizer like 10 more times than I normally do. What do you recommend for that? I know there's no right answer. I might still not do it, but I don't think there's a substitute for handshakes, is there?
There really isn't. I mean, context does play a part. So you work in a hospital. So you weren't in a situation or a context where there's germs. So
Right.
my advice to you is going to be very different to someone who works in an office because they don't have that extra threat level. For you, there is a health factor. So you don't want to shake hands. Perfectly reasonable. You're in a situation where there is a potential health risk. So for you, even just like having your hands together is not going to have the same negative effect as it would in a business meeting because of the context. But say you meet a patient's family and they reach out their hand, there is a level of awkwardness. And absolutely, it can have a negative effect. And there is no alternative. Like, not everybody wants to fist bump.
Yeah.
I've had awkward situations. I've gone to shake a hand, they've gone to fist bump, and I'm like, oh, what do we do? And it's just a little bit awkward. So there is no replacement for shaking hands. But it doesn't mean that if you're uncomfortable, you have to. You just have to be aware, okay, this is expected in this situation. And for me to have the optimal nonverbal presence, I have to engage in doing this thing. But do I still want to? Because it doesn't mean you have to, but you do have to recognize that there could potentially be a negative perception. And just saying, hey, I don't shake hands. Fine. Hey, I don't feel comfortable shaking hands. Hey, I'm a germaphobe. Hey, for this reason, I don't shake hands. Perfectly fine. Perfectly acceptable to say.
Coming back to the thing you said about doctors, I know you said something about when they're talking to their patients or families and their feet are facing away, it's a bad sign. And the families...
It's not just feet, it's the whole lower body.
Okay. I've tried to do... So, for example, I work in a setting where it's not a clinic, so both the doctor and the patient, we're not sitting down. I'm usually moving around in patient rooms and stuff like that. If the patient's family is sitting down and I need to talk to the patient and the family, I try not to hover over them or stand on top. I usually bring in a chair, especially if it's a very important conversation, and sit down.
Yeah.
That's a good thing, right? Because I'm trying to not make them comfortable.
That's a really good thing. Yep. A lot of leaders are told, again, you want to be in the highest position. Because again, it's a dominance factor. Whoever's higher and looking over you is a threat factor. So if you want to be really dominant and powerful, being the tallest one, being the higher position, great. But that's not helpful for empathy. And that's not helpful for necessary confidence and warmth. Being on the same level as people they're sitting, instead of standing over them, sit with them, is really effective because it doesn't have an intimidation factor. You're bringing you to their level. It shows respect and it shows that warmth. So bringing a chair rather than speaking over them is a great way to be. And say you're a boss and you have an interview. You don't want to stand over them. Or say you have someone come into your office for advice. Sit with them. Don't stand over them. It is an intimidation factor.
Okay. And negotiation, if you want to get away with what you want, do you think if somebody's coming to your office, choosing a chair that's higher up, does that make a difference?
No. I mean, the way that I see negotiations is that there's two different types of power. You can have that really political power, which is I'm going to use everything at my disposal to get the most power possible and be the most influential and maybe use the intimidation factor, or the cooperation side of things. And that's where I sit, because I don't just look at the situation at once. I look at long-term relationship building. So if you want a really effective negotiation, do you just want that one negotiation to win and then the relationship not be long-lasting? You want to build positive relationships and you want something that's mutually beneficial. So I don't like the use of intimidation as a nonverbal approach. I always think warmth and trustworthiness and confidence. And warmth doesn't mean small. Warmth doesn't mean less powerful. Warmth can be really powerful. It can be really intimidating, but not in a negative factor. Intimidating because you are so confident and you are so positive. If you're trying to bring someone down and they are relentlessly positive and kind, that can be intimidating because it's strength of character. So I always say, if you're deciding what approach to take, the approach where you make other people feel respected is always the way to go.
Have you seen Donald Trump always pulls people in with his handshake? What does that mean?
Yeah.
I don't know if he does it intentionally or unintentionally. He always does, his hands always on top, which I know shows dominance.
Well, it's a control and power factor.
Yeah.
Yeah, I am the one in control here. I have to say, whoever's hands on top, I would say whoever's hands on top wins. And whoever is highest wins. They're very old tactics of power.
Okay.
And they are very effective. Don't get me wrong, they are effective. But I do think they're short-term effective too, because it does create a negative perception. That negative perception can be great for power, but is that the kind of power you want to have? If I'm going to be a leader, I don't want to be a leader via intimidation factors. I want to be a leader because people respect me and feel respected, which means I take that approach in my nonverbals, and that you can take the other approach perfectly fine, and it will get you the perception of power for sure. But is that the kind of power? I like the kind of power that's cooperative and warm and trustworthy, which can be just as effective, if not more, long term.
What about virtual meetings in Zoom? We do a lot of that now. How should not just leaders, but even, team members be on a Zoom meeting?
Well, all of the same nonverbals in person translate to Zoom. You just can't see the lower body. So what happens is nothing really changes more, it gets intensified. So there's more focus on the hands and the face because everything else is gone. But one thing we forget when it comes to virtual is our environment is our nonverbals. So your background is an extension of your nonverbals because you have complete control. So your clothing, you have control. Your background, you have control. So we often don't think about this as part of our nonverbals, but it says something about you. What do you want it to say? So I have my background very strategic. I'm an academic and I'm an educator. So I have my PhD. I have my undergraduate degree. On the wall, I have my plaque. I have my book because I'm an author. I've got a picture of me and my family. So I'm showing, hey, look, I'm a family person. Hey, look, I am an educated person. And it's clean and it's white and it's clinical. So I'm saying, hey, look, I'm organized. Hey, look, there's no distractions. The only things are, look, I've got a little bit of artwork to show, hey, there's some character in my personality. So these things might seem really basic, but it says something about you. So if you have a background that's really messy, you are signaling, hey, I'm unorganized. If you have absolutely nothing, you might think, oh, it's saying nothing. But you're also losing a trick because you could signal something about yourself that you want to say with your background. You're kind of missing that opportunity. It's better to have a plain background than a messy background because you're kind of starting with a nothing. But if you can utilize your background, like having greenery, there's been studies showing that when we look at plants, it calms down the nervous system. So have just even like I've got a little plant and another little plant, you've got a plant, the little bit of greenery can actually be really calming. So white and bright, green, some like, are you a family person? Those kinds of things are all extensions of nonverbal behaviors that you can integrate into your background.
Okay. What about podcasts? Because one is that on my show, I have a lot of paintings around, and I paint. They're all my paintings. They're all my work. But I wonder if it's a lot. And I try to keep away from the medical side of things. So of course, I don't, unless it's a work meeting, I don't have my degrees or my certificates and stuff like that because it's like a separate part of my life overall. Do you think a lot of paintings is bad too? Or it's just showing that, hey, I'm artistic. This is my work. This is what I do,
When we have too much going on in the background, it has a really similar effect of, those screens that people put that has like a fake background and you can, when they move, you kind of see it around them. too much going on has a very, very similar effect of that of we can't help but look at it. So if I've got loads going on, especially bright colors and distractions, I can't help but look at those things. Like when you're moving and your background is kind of like going in and out, you look at the corners. So you stop paying as much attention, and it can be really distracting. And you don't want distractions. Like if I'm trying to have an intellectual conversation or a serious negotiation, I don't want distraction factors. I want to portray myself in the way that I want to appear. Like I want to appear educated and all of these things. These aren't necessarily distractions. But when you've got lots of things in the background that don't communicate something specific, and be careful with those screens. I would say it's better to have a white background than one of those kind of fake artificial screens that go in and out, because that can be really distracting.
Okay. All right. That's good advice. Well, Dr. Abbie, thank you so much for being here. This was such an insightful conversation. I think we need to do another one of these because there's so many things that I want to talk about. I'm sure our audience will enjoy this and find it really valuable.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.